Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. Today I'll be covering the theme of familiarity in the Israel Keys case. Hope you enjoy. The theme of familiarity is major in the case of Israel Keys. The definition of familiarity is a close acquaintance with or knowledge of something. Let's start off by talking about locations. Israel was familiar with both remote and residential locations. He felt comfortable in communities with convenient travel routes and small towns in which these routes ran through. As you're likely aware, Israel would be fishing or exploring outdoor locations close to towns prior to and following his murders. He claimed to have done this on the courier trip, and these patterns of behaviour were repeated over the years that he was active. On picking a location prior to boarding an aeroplane, he would pick towns along his travel routes and then move from state to state, putting distance between his locations. Along the way, he engaged in different outdoor activities. He could be hiking in a national park or kayaking along a river. In these times of outdoor pursuits, he could think up ideas and watch people. He knew that he could abduct pretty much anyone or wait until his next stop. It's no wonder that he wasn't caught for many years because of this MO. Israel has been sighted in many small towns across the United States. He was seen at a church in upstate New York posing as a homeless person, and this could have been because he was looking for food services which Christian groups generously provide to the needy, or his belief in a higher power had him feeling the need to be closer to his God. And a church is the best place to feel more connected to a higher power after all. Israel was also encountered behind a school smoking in Washington state, along trails in New Hampshire, and some sightings potentially have him in New York City at a bar and on Long Island at a coffee shop. Israel had been seen in Home Depot parking lots and at a mall in Albany, New York in the late 90s, around the time that Suzanne Lyle went missing from the city. Israel was familiar with the United States, and because he had travelled to so many different locations, he'd be comfortable in almost all types of environments, and this makes it difficult to determine who could be a potential victim. Israel's claim that he hunted in the wilderness goes against all of his known victims' abduction locations, and this isn't to discredit this information, it just needs to be taken into account. Israel was familiar with people from all walks of life. He's been seen having conversations with people along hiking trails and in small towns. Israel had made the claim that he would have to take victims by surprise, but it seems odd that someone like him would randomly begin talking to people along remote trails. Were these people intended victims, or was this helping to meet a need or fulfilling him to some capacity? Was Israel just curious and interested in talking to people in different settings? Whatever his true intent, in these conversations he said the same types of things. He usually told the people his real name, and upon being asked about his pretty unusual name, he responded by saying that he had hippie parents and that he was in the area visiting family. There were some elements of truth and some lies in these conversations. In one case, a person resembling Israel had told a couple that he did contracting work and was in the area on vacation for 2 weeks. In other ones, he told people that he was a travelling salesman or insurance salesman. Evidently, Israel was trying to establish himself as something that he wasn't in some of these interactions. His familiarity with people from different walks of life benefited him when it came to finding victims. Deborah Feldman was a prostitute and a substance user, a street person. Israel would have approached Deborah different to 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, who was working at a coffee stand, or someone hiking in a national park. The differences in environments and settings had him encountering all sorts of people from contrasting walks of life. If he could master meeting new people, then he'd be able to better understand others and know how to exploit their needs for his own benefit. Israel was familiar with the internet, and this is more well known now than it was in the past. Israel is often seen as a killer who let victims come to him in the wilderness, despite what I mentioned earlier on. He isn't really well known for using the internet, despite him saying that the way that his crimes would eventually be solved would be through studying his computer usage. Israel could use the internet to sell firearms, and one of these was likely posted under the name Israel on a Utah news website during his time in Texas in March 2012. The podcast True Crime BS has mentioned that Israel likely posted an advert for the courier vehicle on Craigslist after their disappearance. Much like an encounter from an Alaskan parking lot, the woman who arrived to look at the car could see a dark green car circling the parking lot. She never saw the seller, who went by the name Israel, and Israel being amped up following his murders means that if this was him, then he was planning on abducting another victim the day following the courier murders, since he didn't go through with the bank robberies and needed to feed his high. If the courier car advert mentioned on the podcast is to be believed, then Israel's use of the internet is major. It had him repeating patterns, or at least trying new things out online, like seeking out victims. It seems like Israel was very open to using the internet to make money, like the vast majority of people. He claimed that he didn't need money and his crimes weren't done for money, more so for the adrenaline element. But this doesn't sit right with me when it comes to Samantha Koenig's ransom. He was using bank robbery money to pay off his debt, and using Samantha's debit card wasn't the same as taking over a bank. Would it have provided him any form of adrenaline rush? If he sold, traded, or swapped goods and guns online, then why would it be any different with jewellery from burglaries or any other valuable commodities? The internet is how he engaged with customers of his construction business, and it was a way in which he could make sufficient amounts of money and likely have people show up to places where he could abduct them. His familiarity with the internet dates back to the early 2000s, and maybe even prior to this. His use of public libraries and coffee shops means that he might have used their internet services, which distances himself from any serious crimes. However, his use of his own name to list and attempt to sell items or lure someone to a place to abduct them makes me cautious about how accurate these encounters were, or if Israel was that arrogant that he believed that nothing would be tied back to him. What are your thoughts on this? The final point of familiarity relates to Israel's knowledge of other serial killers and the crime genre of entertainment. Israel loved to watch movies like Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. He knew all about serial killers, their methods and ways to avoid being caught. Israel had seen documentaries on other serial killers, one of these being about H.H. Holmes, and he would have known how to respond to certain situations, given his time spent learning about different cases. The ideas learned could be implemented into his own crimes, and through years of copying and expanding on other killers' methods, he could become a seemingly unique serial killer who had a wide range of victim selection and an endless choice of destination in which to travel. In conclusion, over the course of 14 years, Israel became familiar with all different things which aided him in committing his crimes. He knew all about the areas in which he travelled through because of years of experience of driving. He knew how to pick out victims and was aware and at ease in talking to people who were both on the fringes of society and in society. He knew the power of the internet and was familiar with how to make money and potentially employ methods to lure victims to parking lots under the guise of a sale. And finally, he was familiar with the criminal mind and willing to take advantage of new ideas that he'd learned. Everything that he was familiar with helped to make him a more cunning and more dangerous serial killer. Everything could then be merged to help his plans come together. This has been the Israel Keys video on the theme of familiarity. As always, thank you for watching.